Hello, all. Hope you're doing well today. Today, we are diving into chapter 5 and we're talking about motor behavior. This is part 1 of our exploration to how we learn and control movement, which is fundamental, not just in kinesiology, but across sport, rehabilitation, and physical education. Here we go. So, our objectives in this chapter are that you should be able to define motor behavior, motor development, motor control, and motor learning. They are different things. And be able to understand the influence of readiness, motivation, reinforcement, and individual differences on learning the motor skills, as well as understanding selected models of motor learning, the characteristics of performance, and the stages of learning, and be able to draw implications for instruction. Apply to the teaching of motor skills selected concepts of motor learning such as feedback, design of practice, and transfer, and be able to describe the fundamental movements and their development. The primary goals of motor behavior are threefold. Number one, to understand how motor skills are learned. And then second, how they are controlled. And third, how movement changes over time due to development or experience. So we'll be asking, how do people learn motor skills? What happens in the brain and body during practice? And how can we apply this in real life settings like coaching and therapy? So to understand how motor skills are learned, we explore the processes involved when individuals acquire new skills, from riding a bike to performing a complex gymnastics routine. This includes understanding the effects of practice, instruction, and feedback on skill acquisition. Now, to understand how motor skills are controlled, this goal focuses on how the body and brain coordinate movement. It involves studying the nervous system, muscle function, and sensory input to determine how we initiate and regulate movement patterns, especially in different environments or under pressure. And then to understand how movement changes across the lifespan. This includes observing how motor skills develop in infants and children, how they improve with practice during our youth and adulthood, and how they may decline or adapt with aging or after injury. So throughout this chapter, we'll be asking questions like, how do people learn motor skills most effectively, and what changes occur in the brain and body during learning and practice? And most importantly, how can we apply this knowledge in a practical setting such as coaching, physical education, occupational therapy, rehabilitation, and even athletic training? Let's start with some key definitions that form the foundation of motor behavior. Understanding these terms will help clarify the different but interconnected areas we'll be studying. So, motor behavior is the umbrella term that encompasses all aspects of human movement. It includes how we acquire, control, and refine motor skills across the lifespan. It draws from multiple disciplines like psychology and neuroscience, biomechanics, and education to help us understand how people move and why. Now, motor learning, on the other hand, is a subdiscipline under motor development that focuses, or motor behavior, that focuses specifically on the acquisition of motor skills. It investigates how we learn new movements, how long it takes to learn them, how practice and experience shape learning, and what factors enhance or hinder progress. For example, learning to play the piano or improving your tennis serve both involve motor learning. Now, motor control dives into the how of movement. It examines the neural, physical, and behavioral mechanisms that allow us to execute skilled actions. This includes things like coordination, balance, reflexes, and how our body communicates with muscles to create precise goal-directed movements. Now, motor development looks at movement from a lifespan perspective. It explores how movement patterns emerge and change from infancy through old age. It helps us understand developmental milestones in children, as well as how aging or conditions like Parkinson's disease impacts motor abilities later in life. So, keeping these distinctions in mind, they each offer a unique lens to view human movement. Together, they shape how we approach movement scientifically and help us develop evidence-based practices in teaching, coaching, therapy, and rehabilitation. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or performance that results from practice or experience. That means it's not just a one-time improvement or lucky success. It's a lasting change that can be observed over time. Importantly, learning is inferred from performance. In other words, we can't directly see learning happening in the brain. We observe how someone performs a task to determine if learning has taken place. So, what is motor behavior? Motor behavior is the field that studies how people learn, control, and develop movement across the lifespan. It includes the three interconnected areas that we talked about: motor learning and how we acquire and refine motor skill through practice, motor control, how we regulate movement in real time using the brain and body systems, and motor development, how movement skills emerge and change from infancy through old age. So again, together, these areas help us understand everything from a toddler's first steps to an older adult's maintaining balance or an athlete perfecting a serve. To fully understand where the study of motor behavior stands today, it's helpful to look back at how it evolved. So let's begin with two key historical phases, the early period and the middle period. Now, the early period is from 1880 to 1940. And during this time, research primarily focused on how the mind worked rather than on physical movement itself. Scholars were interested in the mental processes behind learning and behavior. One of the most influential figures during this era was Edward Thorndike, who introduced the law of effect, which stated that when a behavior is followed by a positive outcome or reward, it is more likely to be repeated. This idea became fundamental in shaping how we think about learning, including motor learning. Even though the research wasn't yet centered on sports or physical education, this principle laid the groundwork for understanding skill acquisition. Now, the middle period from 1940 to 1970. So by the mid-20th century, research started to shift more towards motor skills and how we control movement. One key figure was Kenneth Craik, who focused on how the brain processes information and uses it to guide physical responses. He essentially introduced the idea that the brain works like an information processing system, which we'll talk about here in just a bit. Another major contributor was Franklin Henry, often considered the father of motor behavior research. He developed the memory drum theory, which proposed that complex movements require more cognitive planning and are stored in memory like programs ready to be activated. His work brought attention to the cognitive elements involved in motor learning and performance. If we transition to later periods, these early and middle period contributions were foundational. They paved the way for the modern study of motor learning, motor control, and motor development as integrated scientific disciplines. As you'll see in the upcoming slides, the late 20th century brought even more interdisciplinary influence, especially from neuroscience and technology. Now we arrive at the present period, beginning in the 1970s and continuing to today. This era marks a major turning point in the field of motor behavior. First, we see the formal emergence of motor learning and motor control as key components within physical education programs and kinesiology departments. These concepts begin to be integrated into curriculum, professional training, and research at universities across the globe. As exercise science matured, the study of how people learn and control movement gained legitimacy as a science. Several major theories were introduced during this period, each offering unique insights and how movement is learned and regulated. The first of those is Adams' closed loop theory. This theory emphasizes the role of feedback in learning motor skills. According to Adams, when we perform a movement, we compare it to a reference of correctness stored in memory. If there's an error, we use feedback to adjust the next attempt. This model works well for slow, precise tasks like drawing or balancing. Now, Schmidt's schema theory, in contrast to Adams, Richard Schmidt proposed that we don't store specific movements, but rather general rules or schemas that help us generate movements in different situations. For example, once you learn how to throw a ball, you can adapt that skill to throw different types of balls under different conditions. This theory helps explain how we transfer learning across tasks. and Kelso's dynamical systems theory. Kelso introduced a more ecological and systems-based approach of movement. Rather than relying solely on brain commands, this theory emphasizes the role of the environment, the body's mechanics, and the self-organization. It suggests that movement patterns emerge naturally from the interaction between the individual, the task, and the environment, like how your gait changes when walking on sand versus pavement. In summary, the present period is marked by a more comprehensive and interdisciplinary understanding of motor behavior. These theories continue to influence how we coach athletes, rehabilitate injuries, teach physical education, and design human-centered technology. As we move forward, new advances in neuroscience, motion tracking, and AI will continue shaping the future of this field. So here are some research questions. How do the type and frequency of feedback impact skill acquisition? With feedback being one of the most critical tools in learning. So should feedback be immediate or delayed? And should it be verbal, visual, or tactical? How does the structure of practice influence the retention of skills? Should you have blocked practice or random practice where you're mixing skills and hoping to enhance long-term retention and adaptability? How does skill performance change as beginners move from novice to advanced levels? And understanding these stages helps our coaches tailor their instruction based on where a learner is in the process. How does aging affect motor control? And what about diseases like Parkinson's? And how does when teaching a skill such as serving in tennis or pitching, should you emphasize speed or accuracy? So these are just a few of the questions that you could ask and research and as we go along. To understand how we learn and perform motor skills, it's helpful to think of the human brain and body as a kind of information processing center, similar to a computer. This is called the information processing model, and it helps explain how we take in information, make decisions, and produce movement. First, you have to have the input stage. It all starts with input. That's really what we're doing right now, is inputting information. And that refers to sensory information we gather from our environment. It's about what we see, what we hear, what we feel. For example, when catching a ball, you use your eyes to track its speed, angle, and direction. And our sensory organs, eyes, ears, muscles, collect this data and send it to the brain for processing. And then there's the decision-making stage. Once the brain has that information, it moves into the decision-making stage. Here, the brain interprets the input and chooses the appropriate response. This is where past experience, training, and skill level come into play. For instance, a basketball player deciding whether to shoot or pass or during a fast break is processing input and rapidly selecting a response based on the situation and their training. Now, execution stage or output is after the brain has made a decision, the body carries out that decision. This is the execution or output stage. So the brain sends signals through the nervous system to muscles to initiate the movement. In our basketball example, this would be the actual pass or jump shot guided by muscle contractions and joint movement and timing. Now the feedback stage is after the movement is executed. We receive feedback, both intrinsic from inside the body and extrinsic from a coach or video replay. And this helps us determine how accurate or successful the movement was. We use this feedback to adjust future actions. If you missed the basket because you were off balance, you might make a better adjustment next time. So to recap, the information processing model includes input, where we're gathering sensory data, and decision making, where we're choosing an appropriate response, and execution is about carrying out the movement, while feedback is evaluating the outcome and refining our future actions. This model is useful for coaches, teachers, and therapists because it helps identify where a breakdown in performance might be happening and how to correct it. When someone is learning a new skill, how can we tell they're actually improving, not just having a lucky day? There are 6 characteristics that help us measure true learning. Let's go through each one. Improvement. The most obvious sign of learning is that they are improving. Over time, the person performs the skill more accurately, efficiently, or successfully. For example, a beginning tennis player starts hitting more balls and bounds over the net as they practice. Consistency. As learning progresses, performance becomes more consistent. This means the learner can repeat the skill with fewer mistakes or fluctuations. Think of a gymnast who lands a routine almost the same way each time, not just once in a while. And stability. It refers to how well performance holds up under pressure, fatigue, or different conditions. A truly learned skill should not fall apart during competition, but bad weather or noise. For instance, a soccer player still performs well in a noisy stadium. And persistence. This means the improvement lasts over time. If someone returns a week later and performs at the same or better level without needing to relearn, that's a sign of true learning. And temporary performance gains like cramming for a test don't necessarily count in this situation. Adaptability shows whether a person can apply the skill in different situations. A basketball player who can shoot accurately from various spots on the court, not just one, demonstrates adaptability. It's especially important in open skill environments, which we'll talk about here in a bit. A reduction in attention span. So as skills become more automatic, they require less conscious thought. The performer doesn't have to focus so hard on every movement, which frees up mental capacity for other things like strategy or decision making. For example, once you master riding a bike, you can ride while talking or navigating. So when evaluating motor skill learning, remember it's not just about getting better, it's about staying better, performing reliably, and adapting when conditions change. These 6 performance characteristics are your benchmarks. As learners progress in acquiring a motor skill, they typically pass through a series of stages. In this slide, we'll talk about the first 2, the cognitive and associative stage. Each of these stages represents a different level of understanding and performance. The cognitive stage is the first stage, where the learner's just beginning to understand the nature and goal of the activity. So at this point, they are often asking questions like, what am I supposed to do? How does this movement work? And they're trying to figure out the basics like how to grip the racket, where to stand, or when to release the ball. And your initial attempts at this stage are usually full of errors, and those errors can be large and inconsistent. That's totally normal. The learner is processing a lot of information and trying to connect instruction to action. For example, think of someone learning to serve a volleyball for the first time. They might swing too early, toss too low, or miss the ball entirely. But each attempt provides valuable feedback. Now, the associative stage occurs once the learner gains some experience. This is where the focus shifts from what to do and how to do it better. They begin refining the skill. Errors still happen, but they're less frequent and more consistent, meaning the mistakes tend to follow a pattern and are easier to correct. Timing and coordination start to improve and movements become smoother. This is the stage where practice really starts to pay off. Learners start recognizing their mistakes and often can correct them without as much external feedback. And we'll go back to our example of the volleyball player who now consistently contacts the ball and gets it over the net, but may still struggle with placement or power. Now, the autonomous stage is a stage where the skill is well coordinated, it's fluid, and it appears effortless to an outside observer. The movements are performed automatically with little conscious thought required. So errors are rare, and when they do occur, the performer often self-corrects quickly without outside feedback. Because the movement no longer requires focused attention, mental resources can now be directed to other aspects of performance, such as strategy and adapting to opponents or anticipating the next play. So, for example, a professional tennis player doesn't think step by step about how to swing the racket. They already know how to do that. So they focus on reading their opponent's body language or planning a drop shot in response to the situation. So we talked about the 3 stages of learning. Now we're going to talk about factors that influence learning. The first step of that is readiness. This refers to the physiological and psychological state that affects an individual's ability and willingness to learn. It includes factors such as physical health, fatigue, emotional state, prior knowledge, and cognitive development. And motivation. This is an internal condition with an individual that initiates and directs activity towards achieving a goal. It influences the initiation, persistence, or maintenance, and intensity of learning behavior. Motivated learners are more likely to engage actively and sustain effort in the learning process. Other factors that influence learning are reinforcement. This is the use of events, actions, or consequences to increase the likelihood that a specific response or behavior will occur again. It can be positive, which is adding a pleasant stimulus to encourage behavior, or negative, which is removing an unpleasant stimulus to encourage behavior. Now, there are also individual differences, which refers to the unique background, physical abilities, skills, learning styles, and personalities of each learner. These differences affect how each person processes and responds to learning experiences. So, taking in the information regarding the stages of learning and the factors that influence learning, you as a coach, physical therapist, can structure practice sessions to create the best possible conditions for learning. You want to include variability and appropriate difficulty based upon the stage of learning and sufficient repetition to promote skill acquisition and retention. You also want to facilitate understanding, so help learners comprehend the purpose and requirements of the task and why they're doing it. Use demonstrations and explanations and feedback to clarify what successful performance looks like. So it's good to know who your learners are and what skills they have, so that you're not always having to demonstrate. You can have them demonstrate if they can do it proficiently. And consider skill characteristics. So tailor practice design based on the nature of the skill or task, whether that's discrete versus continuous, open versus closed skills, and match practice methods for the specific demands of the skill for more effective learning. And we'll go through more of that here in the next setup. So you just set up your practice session, and now you have to decide, are you going to use closed skills or open skills? Closed skills are performed in a stable, predictable environment. The performer controls the timing and movement, so it's very self-paced. And this, for example, a gymnastics routine performed in practice, or shooting a free throw in basketball in practice, or typing on a keyboard. These all emphasize consistency and precision versus open skill. This is performed in a changing, unpredictable environment, so the performer must adapt movements in response to external factors, so it's externally paced. And in this situation, you would be for soccer, if you're playing in a soccer game, things are coming at you in different times and in different movements. Driving in traffic, you got to watch for all those crazy drivers around you, and or hitting a pitched baseball. This is more of an emphasis on adaptability and decision making, and it's on a continuum, as you can see demonstrated here on the slide. Some key principles in motor skill learning are whole versus part method. The decision to teach a skill as a whole or in part depends on the complexity of the skill and the learner's experience. Complex or serial skills may benefit from part practice, while simple or continuous skills are often taught as a whole. Speed versus accuracy emphasis. So whether to focus on speed or accuracy during skill teaching depends on the specific demands of the task or sport. and transfer of learning. Previous learning experiences can help facilitate the acquisition of new motor skills, especially when there are similarities between skills or context. And feedback. Providing learners with information about their performance is crucial to guide improvement and reinforce correct execution. Now, we all get to those performance plateaus. This is where learners reach a period where progress seems to stall. Recognizing this helps maintain motivation and adjust training methods. And self-analysis and technology, encouraging learners to analyze their own performance, possibly using technology like video playback or motion sensors, enhances skill development. And leadership influence. The style and quality of leadership or instruction can significantly affect how much learning occurs. When a skill requires both speed and accuracy, teachers must carefully decide which element to emphasize during different stages of learning. Early practice may focus more on accuracy to build correct technique, then gradually increase emphasis on speed once accuracy is reliable. Balancing those elements helps learners develop effective and efficient performance, as noted in the picture here on the slide. Now, beliefs about growth, development, and physical activity vary widely across cultures. As professionals, it's essential to understand how these cultural perspectives shape an individual's participation in physical activity and the acquisition of motor skills across the lifespan. Respecting and adapting to these beliefs can enhance engagement and learning outcomes. Additionally, while many recognize the benefits of physical activity for older adults, ageism, which is the discrimination based on age, can create barriers. These may include limited opportunities, social stereotypes, and reduced access to programs and resources. So it's crucial to advocate for inclusive environments that promote lifelong physical activity and learning for individuals of all ages. Motor learning is influenced by a variety of factors, including readiness, motivation, reinforcement, individual differences, and the structure of practice sessions. Educators must consider whether to teach a skill as a whole or in parts, and whether to emphasize speed or skill, depending on the nature of the skill and the learner's needs. Feedback plays a crucial role by providing corrective information and reinforcing effort and motivating factors. At its heart, motor behavior combines the three key components of motor learning, motor control, and motor development. Together, these areas help us understand movement in everyday life and performance settings. And the information processing model explains how we go from sensing a situation to executing a movement and adjusting in the future with input, decision, execution, and feedback. And the skill learning indicators of learning how to improve and be consistent, and stability, as well as persistence and adaptability. And the stages of learning, knowing where your learner is at in one of those three stages and how you can structure practices accordingly. So these key concepts provide the framework for understanding how people become skilled movers, whether they're learning to walk, serve a tennis ball, or recover from an injury. As we move deeper into motor behavior, we'll explore how to apply these principles in real-world settings. And that is all that I have for you today. I look forward to talking with you again. Next, we'll go into part 2 of Chapter 5. See you soon. Have a great day.